This is the second part of a three-part video. In the previous part we have talked about brain organization and its relevance, possible relevance to phenomenology of mental disorders. We talked about emergent properties like consciousness, awareness, mood, which are not part of the elements of the system. You don't see them in neurons, but whole brain organization achieves such properties. And we talked about the hierarchical organization of the brain. We talked about the ability of the brain to embed information in connectivity structures. And we talked about small world network organization, which is effective information transfer, optimal organization of the brain. In this video, I will try to describe the spectrum of mental phenomenology and compare it or relate it to possible patterns of brain disturbances to the whole brain organization. And I will try to divide by simplifying the field. I will try to define the clinical phenomenology in three parts: personality disorders, mood disorders, and psychosis and schizophrenia. And we'll start with personality disorders. Personality disorders are disorders of the way people adapt and react to the environment. It is specific patterns, typical patterns of reacting and interacting with the environment in a rigid, non-adaptive way, which generates failures and suffering. Now, if you want to understand personality disorders and see how it is related to the brain, we need to go back to the 1800s, when Theodore Maynard described the individual personality structures, relating them to brain organization, in the sense that already in 1800 he said that when you have an experience or thought, it is represented by an activation of groups of neurons. If you have another thought or another experience, another group of neurons is activated. If you have associations between them, and the experience is built up in association manner, then you have connectivity between these activations. So he said that each one of us has a basic connectivity structure in the brain, which is a substrate of his personality and individuality. And he looked for a name for that, and he called it ego. Ego is a term coined by Maynard to describe connectivity patterns organization, basic connectivity organization pattern in each individual. Sigmund Freud was a student of Maynard. He was a resident at his department, and he agreed with this term of ego, and he even tried to develop it further. But at a certain situation he decided to develop it theoretically, not related to the brain, and talk about how it develops, what influences the ego, and so on. And that was when psychology was born. Psychologists later carefully investigated patients, and they described a set of internal representations which they called objects. And this is how object relation psychology was born. And in object relation psychology, personality is described as a reaction to the environment, to the psychosocial environment, based on how objects, other people which are objects, and the self-object are represented in the brain, in the human subject. But today, from the previous part of the video, we know that by Hebbian algorithm we can actually embed information and embed internal models of the world in the brain. So we have the conceptual description of how a physical system, connectivity physical system, can actually achieve the internal representation, which are at a basic assumption for object relation psychology. And also the development of the internal objects, which are dynamic and experience dependent, these are also could be explained, this could also be explained by using experience-dependent plasticity, Hebbian dynamics, which also changes according to the environment. Actually, if we go further, we know that the environment constantly changes the internal representation, or even more. We know that the brain predicts the changes in the environment and tries to adapt to it. But because the environment is very dynamic and the plasticity is limited, then there will always be a kind of mismatch between what happens in the environment and the internal representation. But the brain acts all the time to reduce this difference. And this was termed free energy. The free energy increases when there is mismatch, and the brain tries to reduce it by reducing free energy, the differences, the statistical differences between the occurrences in the environment and the internal representation. This could be mathematically described, and Carl Freestone in his work, his famous work, shows how you can use Bayesian statistics in order to evaluate and assess such reductions of free energy. So the brain develops attempting to reduce free energy, attempting to adapt to occurrences in the environment, and this is done by generating internal models of the environment which adapt always dynamically to the environment. So we have now a good description of how the brain might achieve these psychological descriptions. Now in recent years, amazingly, it was found that when the brain is at rest, doing no task, no cognitive task, at a default mode, let's say, default meaning that there is no task, cognitive task, then it was found that the brain achieves a connectivity network structure, which is called the default mode network, or sometimes it's called the resting state network. And such a network is probably what Maynard predicted, the ego. So we can begin, you can see that we can begin and replace terminology which is unrelated to the brain, like ego, and name it now the default mode network. And now the default mode network has been found to be optimal also as a small world network organization. In the previous talk we talked about small world brain organization, which is the most effective and optimal. And now if we know that we have a default mode network, which is a small world network, and it is optimal for representing internal representation, which determines the way we react to the environment, which actually determines how our personality traits are, then we can start and begin and translate terms like personality into optimal small world network organization of the default mode network. And this can take us a step further, and we can start conceptualizing the personality disorders as disorders to the default mode network. But what kind of type of disorder? Disorder to the small world network organization. And actually today, 2013, 2012, there are papers, initial papers, which talk about aberrant and biased small world network organization in the default mode network in personality disorders. So actually people are beginning to validate such hypotheses. But we as psychiatrists are ready now to begin and use brain-related terminology. Instead of saying personality disorder, which is unrelated to any brain location or structure, we can start and talk about disturbances to the default mode network, or we can actually go further and say disturbances to small world network parameters in the default mode network, which is actually related to the brain. So in this way, this part of personality disorders would be now connected to taxonomy, which is neuroscientific.